On Sunday, January 10th, we flew from Miami to San Jose, Costa Rica. The words you can see in the grass, pura vida, are a distinctively Costa Rican expression. Literally, they mean pure life, but they're used much more broadly than that would suggest. They're used as a greeting, meaning roughly, "Are things good with you?" They're used as a reply, meaning, "Hey, thanks, things are good." They're used to describe people, meaning that they're nice and easygoing. They're used to describe a situation, meaning that everything's great. We would hear pura vida a lot in Costa Rica and come to use it ourselves quite naturally. As soon as we got to the baggage area at the airport, we were met by representatives of our tour, and then spent the next 45 minutes being driven in circles around the airport while we waited for some late arrivals. The upside and downside of having an arranged ride. But it gave me a chance to enjoy this sign for its very non-North American approach to communication. Whether you translate estimado usuario as esteemed user or dear passenger as they did here, it sure indicates a different worldview. I've been in airports where, "Hey you, bub," would have been the more authentic greeting. We had an orientation session in the hotel that evening, and then the next morning a history lecture. Then we headed out on foot with our guide, Gloriana. She had the enthusiasm of a kid and the energy of a 30-year-old. The gray hair may have come from working as a guide for about 30 years. Out on the street, she pointed out that the people were sort of average. As she said, not too tall or too short, not too dark or too light. As we walked, we saw familiar things, like a Starbucks, and very unfamiliar ones, like Christmas trees with cellophane leaves, in fuchsia and lime green. I took note, too, of a piece of art masquerading as a bench. I figured it had to be art. I mean, who could even sit on that, much less relax? We stopped at the National Theatre, just poking our noses into the gilt-edged foyer, beautifully restored with some impressive statuary. Then we got to the Museum for Pre-Columbian Gold, which was part of a complex with a coin and an art museum. The displays were extensive, about 1,600 artifacts, of which you'll be glad to hear that I took pictures of only a few. There were human figures, some four-legged animals I couldn't identify, although one might have been a big cat. There were several bird-like figures. I saw a bat and a butterfly, I think. And lots of frogs. As we left, I was interested to see that the artistic presentation extended to the air ducts for what I assume was the building's air conditioning system. Then we went back to the hotel to meet our driver, Chicho, and to load our stuff on the bus and to head off on our tour. Our itinerary called for a counterclockwise loop through the central part of the country, hitting the main areas. The Central Mesa, where San Jose is, then to Sarapiquí in the Caribbean lowlands, on to Mount Arenal in the volcanic region, and finally to Monteverde in the cloud forest, before returning to San Jose for our flights home or wherever. So the 18 of us boarded our 24-passenger bus, and off we went. On the way out of town, we saw what looked like shanty housing, except for the satellite receivers on top. After lunch, our first of several typical lunches or authentic cuisine characterized by rice, beans, and plantains, we continued driving through the mountain passes. On one bridge, they stopped the bus so we could get a good view of two streams that were coming together. One crystal clear and the other all silted up. Both reminded me of types of streams I've seen in the Canadian Rockies, but never so close together. As we dropped in elevation, we came into the Caribbean lowlands, which are perfect for all kinds of agriculture, and stopped at a roadside fruit stand, which also sold other groceries, packaged chips and cookies, bread and spices, among other things. Now, some of the products were familiar to us, bananas and onions, for example. Some we figured out, like the persimmons and the plantain chips. And some we had never seen before. We learned that the green fruit was soursop. We had had soursop juice for lunch, and it was very nice. But I never did get the name of the red fruit. Our next stop was a small grocery store in Sarapiquí, the town near our hotel. Some folks wanted to buy wine and other drinks and snacks for their hotel rooms. I'm always intrigued by grocery stores in other countries. Many foods are the same, of course, like the rice and beans, but there was way more variety in brands and types than we'd have at home. And there were also new foods, like the Lisano salsa, a Costa Rican sauce that's a lot like HP sauce, and a great addition to rice and beans. Lisano is so popular with tourists that it even has its own Facebook page, chronicling where to get it outside Costa Rica. And there were other products that we wouldn't find at home. We saw packages of instant iced coffee and tins of dulce de leche, a caramel sauce made from sweetened milk, a common flavor in Latin American desserts. As I'd seen before in Latin America, many more products are packaged in plastic bags instead of plastic or glass bottles. Ketchup, for example, that's salsa americana here, and what we call salsa, that's salsa mexicana. Powdered laundry soap comes in plastic bags too, instead of cardboard boxes. Then we arrived at our hotel, Selva Verde, or Green Forest Lodge, named for the area. The foyer reminded me of hotels in Hawaii, with an open air to the paths to the rooms. Surprise! Although we were in a hot, humid place, there was no air conditioning in those rooms. As Gloriana said, though, it would allow us to experience and enjoy the rainforest authentically. And the bedrooms did have ceiling fans, so we slept just fine. One of the features of the place was a bird feeder beside the human feeder or dining room. From the balcony, I spent part of every mealtime over the next 2 days getting bad shots of wonderful birds. The clay-colored thrush, Costa Rica's national bird, and the beautiful red summer tanager. The oropendola, which has a yellow band on the end of its tail, and the black-cheeked woodpecker, and a red-rumped tanager. But there were more than birds, such as this golden-orbed spider, which made a web strong enough to withstand Gloriana leaning into it with both hands. There were things I expected to find in trees, like the howler monkeys and this white-faced monkey, and some things I certainly didn't expect to find in trees, like this male iguana, sunning himself at the top of a tree that was about 40 feet high. Or this Jesus Christ lizard, so named for its ability to sprint across a few meters of water when startled, using its huge, splayed-out feet. But all in all, it was easier to get pictures of the things that didn't move, like the view from the bar and the lush vegetation. And the hanging bridge over to the undisturbed rainforest. One morning we went whitewater rafting. It was pretty gentle, I guess, mostly Class 1 rapids, but it was a lot of fun anyway. On command, we paddled and leaned in and lifted our paddles and shouted "Pura vida" when we had survived a bumpy ride through a set of rapids. About halfway through, we pulled over to the shore and had fresh fruit. And as long as we kept our life jackets on, we were allowed to take a dip in the river. Our last morning at Sarapiquí, we went for a different kind of boat ride on the same river, downstream from the rapids, to look for birds and animals. We saw several kinds of herons and kingfishers and anhingas and some white-faced bats asleep on a tree, but the highlights were the caiman, a member of the crocodile family, and an iguana facing down a howler monkey at the top of a very tall tree. Then we were off and driving roughly northwest, headed to Mount Arenal. We stopped for a snack at the Iguana restaurant, right beside a bridge over a small gorge, with big iguanas lolling around on the tree branches. In the same town, we stopped at another grocery store, this one looking more like the North American version. But again, I saw familiar products in unfamiliar brands, Status toilet paper, for example, and in new presentations, eggs on a shelf rather than in a refrigerator. We could also have bought white toast in a cellophane package and any kind of cornmeal that we wanted. Back on the bus, we drove past more farms, noting the living fences that they use, pruned saplings with barbed wire wrapped around them. And so we made our way to our next stop, the town of La Fortuna, near Mount Arenal, now an inactive volcano. Our hotel was a resort, really, with large and lovely grounds. That night we had a video presentation on volcanoes. The next morning we headed off to Arenal Hanging Bridges Park, which covers 250 hectares of protected rainforest. Now, the rainforest isn't the easiest place to see wildlife, but we did see a few coati, which look a lot like raccoons. The park itself was pretty crowded with other visitors. As if there weren't enough hazards just sort of lurking beside the trail, like this eyelash viper, Gloriana enticed a tarantula out of a hole in the embankment. She inserted a thin, stiff piece of grass, which the spider would grab, and then she pulled it out for all of us to see. Not all the hazards were biological. Our walk crossed 15 bridges over gorges, 6 of them suspension bridges, some quite long and bouncy. Some members of our group were afraid of heights, or at least not happy to stand on a bridge bouncing around over a great height, but everyone got through it. Me, I was more concerned about going into the jumping pit viper tunnel. All the bridges and tunnels had names of rainforest animals, so I didn't expect to encounter any snakes here, but I honestly hadn't thought about jumping vipers of any sort before that exact moment, and would have been happy never to have that thought. I mean, exactly how far can they jump? After lunch, some folks went to the spa, and the rest of us went ziplining on the hotel property. There were 12 platforms, 11 cables, some at 80 meters above the ground, with the longest distance between platforms being 350 meters. The steepest cable had us going 60 kilometers an hour, or so said our handlers. It was a first for me, and a last, if I'm honest. But what really impressed me was the folks who did it even though they were afraid of heights. My own most memorable moment was whizzing past a tree right beside the cable and hearing the howler monkeys roaring at me. The next day we were off again, only a little the worse for wear, this time to take a boat ride across Lake Arenal, seeing ospreys, white egrets, cormorants, and great blue herons. When we got across the lake, we were picked up by another bus, and we bounced along gravel roads uphill and down, getting yet more views of Mount Arenal and the surrounding hills. It's very picturesque, but maybe not an easy place to make a living. We stopped for a restroom and snack break at a restaurant where the biggest hits were the resident dog and parrot. And so we arrived at Monteverde, or Green Mountain, an area that had been settled by Quakers from the U.S. after World War II. They were looking for a place where their pacifist views wouldn't land them in jail, and figured that a country that had no standing army was a good bet. We stopped at a coffee plantation for lunch and the full tour, which included coffee and chocolate tasting. We met one of the ox cart drivers, as well as the original owner, the not very tall Don Juan. Then we were off to our next hotel, which had lovely facilities and grounds, and which had rooms set into terraces down the hill, giving great views of the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. We had 2 more lectures here, one on bats and one on the Quakers. The next day we went for a walk at Curicancha Reserve, much less crowded than the park at Arenal. We stood at the Continental Divide, and we saw at least 10 different kinds of hummingbirds, a turkey in a tree, and we caught a glimpse of the elusive quetzal with its long red tail. As usual, though, it was the vegetation that was more cooperative with respect to photography. In this case, a banana plant flower and a trumpet flower. After a visit to a local arts and crafts co-op and a wonderful pizza lunch, we visited the Bat Jungle, again established by an expatriate American. The next morning we visited a butterfly garden, but our volunteer host, who was from Hamilton, Ontario, had to show us the other critters first, which included a tarantula, a leaf-mimicking katydid, and the biggest cockroach I ever hoped to meet, even in someone else's hand. He reassured us that although they had leaping insects and biting insects in their collection, they didn't have any that did both. Then we were finally off to see the butterflies in about 6 big enclosures. My favorite was the one that looked like a cutout or a piece of stained glass. Now we headed down to the Pacific coast, stopping at Sarchi, an arts and crafts center, along the way. The brightly decorated ox carts are a national symbol and are apparently still in use in some rural areas, although we didn't see any outside tourist areas. We visited a workshop that's been powered by water since the 1920s. Then we were off to San Jose, completing our loop. The next morning we got to the airport the recommended 2 hours ahead of flight time and got through check-in, a police check of documents, and security in about 20 minutes. So we had lots of time to explore all the gift shops at the airport. Unlike the Panama City airport, where it's all high-end duty-free products, jewelry, electronics, that sort of thing, these stores were all focused on Costa Rican products: coffee, chocolate, carvings, music, cookbooks, and other souvenirs. Because we hadn't stayed in any major centers except coming and going, we were amused to see the North American fast food outlets. We could have been in any American airport. And that concluded our week and our taste of Costa Rica, courtesy of Gloriana and Chicho. Thanks, guys. Pura vida.